Yes, welcome everyone to the second Philsoc talk of the semester. We are very, very excited to be hosting Alexander Nehamas. He'll be speaking to us about the definition of philosophy and the description of philosophers in the Republic. And Professor Nehamas is the Edmund N. Carpenter Professor in the Humanities at Princeton University and Professor of Philosophy and Comparative Literature. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the Academy of Athens, and has published influential work on ancient Greek philosophy, the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, and the philosophy of art, among other topics. So yes, have a warm welcome from your computer screen for Professor Nehamas.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. It's here. No, I'm not happy to be here. You know what I mean. A few disclaimers. I have been losing my voice for some reason, so I will be hoarse as I speak today. That's one. The second is, this is a very deflationary paper. What I'm trying to do is to say that much less happens in this extremely important passage of the Republic than we generally think. And the positive side is, which I'm excited about, is what it is that Plato thinks the objects of epistēmē, which I will not, though I will be tempted to do so, call knowledge. It is not knowledge, and I don't want it to be thought of as knowledge. What are the objects, and what is it that you have epistēmē of when you have epistēmē? This is what I'm really interested in. In any case, let me just go into it, and we can discuss things as we go along. Can you see me all right? Everything is okay? Okay. All right. So toward the end of the fifth book of the Republic, when Socrates proposes to discuss what he calls the smallest change that would allow the just city to come about, he describes it as the greatest difficulty he has yet encountered, likely to drown him, as he puts it, in a wave of outright ridicule and contempt. And he's right. For this smallest change is nothing other than his proposal that the city must be governed by philosophers, a proposal that can't have been less than astonishing to his original audience. But many of us today, especially those of us who read the Republic on a regular basis, have associated that radical idea with Plato for so long that we have lost our sense of how extraordinary, not to say how laughably bizarre, it must have been to those who are hearing it for the first time. And so we have failed to take its outrageousness into account. In fact, however, Plato's scheme may have sounded as unthinkable to the Athenians of his day as the depressing possibility that a failed and dishonest businessman might restore their country to its mythical old glory still seems to many present-day Americans, especially after last night's debacle. To see why philosophers would have seemed absurdly unsuitable for the role the Republic assigns to them, we need not go far. The words of Plato's own urbane and worldly Callicles in the Gorgias testify to the utter contempt directed at those who pursued what was loosely known as philosophy at the time, and that I have in T1 in the handout that I sent along. You do have a handout, don't you? You do have a handout? Okay. Of the 109 references to philosophy and its cognates in the Republic, only 9 occur before our passage. And only in a broad sense, close to Pericles' positive use of it in the funeral oration, where he attributes philosophy to all Athenians, or Socrates' negative approach to it in his Helen. In fact, philosophy doesn't really become an issue in the Republic until 2/3 of the book are already over. And it's very important to remember that, I think. How Plato now proposes to understand philosophy and its role in the city are ideas we are totally unprepared for. And his proposal represents a staggering new step in his thought. In other words, these pages are where philosophy, as we understand it today, is being established systematically for the first time and emerges as a highly specialized and deeply elaborate educational system, in fact, a whole way of life, as the argument that begins in Book V progresses in its very slow and methodical way. Plato is quite aware that he's making a very radical claim. Not only is he demanding that rulers devote themselves to learning, already a strange and unexpected requirement, whoever expected the tyrant of a city or the elected officials to be particularly educated, but the learning he requires, as Socrates' interlocutors and the Republic's readers very gradually find out, is radically different from anything they could have imagined before. This is very new stuff, and Socrates, as Plato's spokesman, is being extremely slow and methodical. The claim he makes in Book V on behalf of the philosopher ruler is not finally justified until the end, the very end of Book VII. Everything in this long stretch of text, the central part of the work, is a piece of a single account of what philosophers and philosophy, a new learning, a new type of person, a new way of life actually are. That has some serious implications for the argument that opens this account and closes Book V. Most important, his argument in these few pages, which have been discussed ad nauseum, right? His argument in these pages is less radical and establishes considerably weaker conclusions than we regularly attribute to it. In particular, Plato does not introduce, here is a litany of things. Plato does not introduce the theory of forms at this point. He doesn't distinguish knowledge from belief. He doesn't explain what allows the philosophers to be the city's rulers. In fact, he doesn't give anything approaching an account of what a philosopher is in the first place. The argument with the people he calls the sightlovers, we'll discuss them in detail, from whom Plato distinguishes the philosophers, is only a first and relatively small step in the long discussion that stretches all the way to the end of Book VII. So the first step of the argument, it's if you have a text, it's from 474c to 475c, is that philosophers are lovers of all wisdom. And Socrates makes it clear that he needs to say what a philosopher is, designed to help the claim that they are the most fitting rulers. And what he does is he reminds Glaucon here of their earlier agreement in Book IV, that to truly love something is to love all and not just part of it, and provides several examples of what he has in mind. The first applies to Glaucon himself. Lovers of boys like him, he says, will always find something to love and admire in every boy of the right age. A snub nose is cute, a hooked nose, regal. One that's in between, well-proportioned. Same thing goes for skin color. No boy in bloom is ever rejected. And let me open up an emphasis here. Some of you may know that already, but I just found out a few years ago. There is a direct connection between this passage of the Republic and the famous catalog aria in Don Giovanni by Mozart, where Don Giovanni's servant explains to this woman that Don Giovanni loves all women, young, old, blonde, whatever. And how we know that is as follows. Lucretius picks up this idea that, lovers of boys love all boys at all kinds. He turns it into heterosexual preferences. So he talks about women and how men like women of all kinds. Molière picks it up, and Da Ponte, who's Mozart's librettist, takes it from Molière. And Molière, we know, translated Lucretius into French, though we have lost the translation. So from Plato, maybe through others, to Lucretius, from Lucretius to Molière, from Molière to Da Ponte, from Da Ponte to Mozart. Amazing. Now, I think that has left me speechless. Well, not speechless. I speak a lot about it, actually. But anyway, okay. So, same thing applies to lovers of wine, philoine. It applies to lovers of honor. They love whatever kind of wine it is, whatever kind of honor it is, they love it. On the basis of those analogies now, Socrates says that philosophers are people who love all wisdom and not just some of its parts, unlike, for example, those who, even when hungry, are picky about what they want and are therefore they eat, and therefore not real lovers of food. There is, however, something strange in those analogies. They're without a doubt less than flattering. After all, people who truly love and appreciate something, whether it's boys, wine, honor, or food, are usually highly discriminating. A wine connoisseur, for example, will taste whatever is served, but will only drink what meets certain stringent conditions. Similarly, Plato would have known that honors bestowed by unworthy people are not welcome to those who take honor seriously, and Aristotle talks about it explicitly. Similarly, one who eats whatever is available is less a gourmet than a glutton. Even the general conclusion of the argument is stated in language that seems peculiar. Having mentioned food, Socrates stays with the image. Like the gourmands or gluttons, whatever, like them, philosophers, he says, are intent to taste all philosophy, eagerly enjoy as menos to learn, and more surprising, can't have enough of it. The word he uses here is aplestos, insatiable, which is really a pretty negative word, really. In any case, why the light and playful tone of this passage? I believe it serves to encourage both Glaucon and our reader and us to find the beginning of what will turn out to be a long and arduous path, relatively easy and enjoyable. Perhaps they're supposed to think of it as a joke before they're gradually exposed to its seriousness, and to be willing to follow it as it gets more and more difficult. Moreover, Socrates' emphasis on what I might call the promiscuity of the lovers he discusses makes it much easier for Glaucon to ask how philosophers can be distinguished from the enthusiastic sight lovers he is about to compare them to. The discussion of the sight lovers, in turn, gives Socrates the opportunity to introduce another and more serious feature of philosophers. At the same time, I must really warn against thinking that, as a number of people have said, and I'm quoting now from one recent paper on the topic, in these pages, Socrates offers a definition of the philosopher. We don't have a definition of philosopher here. The argument, as I will argue, is the very first step in a long process that does not culminate until the end of Book VII, when, after Socrates has described the philosopher's ethical character, the reasons for their bad reputation, the real objects of their knowledge, and the educational and practical path they need to follow, he finally reveals that what enables them to be the rulers of the city is that the tortuous path he's presented eventually leads them to an understanding of the nature of the form of the good. And it's only then, once we know that these are the people who know what the nature of the good is, that we know what a philosopher is. So to move on to another section, philosophers versus sight lovers, part one and many, the argument about the difference between one and many. Glaucon worries that Socrates' partly tongue-in-cheek, slightly ironic attitude towards philosophers, and especially his emphasis on their indiscriminate love of learning, won't distinguish them from a group of people who may resemble them superficially, he says, but don't deserve to be considered philosophers. He calls them lovers of sight, philotheamones. Philo, of course, is the term that we have in all those compounds here, hence philosophy. Lovers of sights who enjoy learning things. They're also lovers of sounds who are unwilling to engage in discussion but can't have enough of theatrical spectacles. And there are still others who are interested in similar things, he says, without specifying what, and like various insignificant crafts. A little later, he also refers to this group as lovers of craft and as practical people. And a little later on, in 484 and beginning of Book VI, he seems to consider that the class of the non-philosophers is very broad indeed. So these sight lovers is just a term that applies only to one little group within this much larger group, but we have gotten used to using it collectively for the whole group. So the class of sight lovers, although left vague, is very extensive, and I will return to that issue later on. When Socrates limits the field, it says that only those who are lovers of the sight of truth, thesaletheas philotheamones, only these are true philosophers. Glaucon, and remember that, doesn't understand, and he wants to have more explanation, and Socrates proceeds to give it. I'm saying it's important that Glaucon doesn't understand because a little later we'll see that people think that Glaucon already is a philosopher, and I think that's absolutely not true. So Socrates begins his explanation by means of an argument to the effect that since the beautiful, he says, is contrary to the ugly, they are therefore two distinct things, and since they are two, he continues, each is one. He then generalizes the point, which applies equally, he says, to just and unjust, good and evil, and all the ede, eidos, the singular, eida in the plural, the words which are often used for the forms, and accordingly have made people think that the forms are present in this passage. I will dispute that as I go on. Each, he writes, is one, but because they appear everywhere, combined with actions, bodies, and one another, each appears to be many. So we have a contrast between the one eidos and its many appearances. He then elaborates, Socrates elaborates, by saying that the sight lovers are attracted by beautiful voices, shapes, and everything that is produced by such things, but are incapable of seeing the nature of the beautiful itself. We have this constant contrast here between the many and the one. And he draws another contrast between the sight lovers and the rare people, he says, who see the beautiful in itself. The sight lovers can't even follow if somebody tries to explain to them what the difference is. Not only can they think of it themselves, they can't even understand somebody who explains it to them, and they live not in a dream. They live not in reality, but in a dream, whereas philosophers says never confuse the one and the many, and they live in reality. Accordingly, he says, philosophers have gnome. Gnome is synonymous with gnosis and epistēmē, which is the term I will use a lot, which is what the term that we often translate as knowledge. And I want to warn you very, very seriously that that is a big, big mistake and makes hash of a lot of that Plato is saying, whatever. So philosophers have gnome or gnosis or epistēmē, a mode of cognition that's widely considered to be higher, more reliable, and more valuable than doxa, which is what Plato confines the sight lovers to. So we have epistēmē and we have doxa, generally thought of as knowledge and belief. Don't think that way, yet anyway. Naturally, the sight lovers resent their epistemic demotion. Socrates therefore undertakes to convince them that they can only aspire to doxa by means of an additional argument that, as he puts it, aims to, quote, soothe and gently persuade them. What does that mean? Well, it may mean that we have to impose a certain procedural condition on the argument. And one such condition, it has been proposed by Gail Fine, who wrote a very influential paper on this passage many years ago, and I'll come back to her, is that if Socrates, I quote her, if the argument is to rest on genuinely non-controversial issues, as he claims it does in the sentence, soothe and gently persuade, it cannot assume the theory of forms or any other esoteric theory unacceptable to the sight lovers at the outset. So it says, look, the sight lovers don't believe in the theory of forms, so you can't appeal to the theory of forms in order to refute them or to show them anything. But why, I ask, need we think that the argument might presuppose the theory of forms, which we must show to be only apparent, as Fine will try to do? Her reason is that the distinction between one and many, between the many beautiful things and the beautiful itself, which Socrates has already used, belongs to the theory of forms. In other words, the theory of forms is introduced at 476a, when Socrates distinguishes the beautiful itself from the many beautiful. That, she argues, might have been to appeal to the theory of forms while she was talking to Glaucon. While he was talking to Glaucon, he says, may have been all right, because Glaucon is already familiar with the theory. Notice this. Where is he supposed to have become familiar with the theory? We haven't seen it in the dialogue. Maybe he's referring to other dialogues, but we haven't seen Glaucon ever discuss the theory of forms with Plato. And in fact, according to this interpretation, Glaucon and Socrates agree here that philosophers are epistēmē because they recognize the forms, while the sight lovers who don't only have doxa. In other words, it's the ontological distinction between forms and participants that grounds the distinction between epistēmē and doxa that is being discussed in this passage. At this point, however, Socrates abandons Glaucon and seems to turn to the sight lovers themselves to convince them directly. But the sight lovers don't recognize the forms. That is exactly what disqualifies them as philosophers. Socrates, therefore, would be begging the question, if he appealed to the theory and Fine's argument continues, his desire to soothe and gently persuade them shows that he knows it. So she attributes to him a requirement to the effect that a good dialectical investigation, I quote her, should only use claims that are believed to be true and that the interlocutor accepts. So you can't, if I'm having an argument with you, I can't appeal to a premise that you're not going to accept. I have to appeal only to premises that you already accept, which is really the principle of the elenchus, if you remember. So when Socrates says that the object of epistēmē is what is, to on, Fine assumes that the term, which seems to pick out the one we've just been talking about, that the sight lovers are unaware of, can't refer to the forms, which appeared in the previous argument, since that would be the question, and we must interpret it in some non-controversial manner that will be all right for the sight lovers to accept. So her argument is, far from referring to forms, what is must be interpreted, as she puts it, veridically, following one of the famous distinction that Charles Kahn made years ago between a veridical use of the verb is in Greek, which means to say that something is, to say it is the case, an existential use, where when you say that something is, you're saying it exists, and a predicative use that says that when you say that something is, you're saying it's something or other without making the predicate explicit. So she thinks we have to interpret it veridically. Let's see where I am. So all that to on, or what is, means for fine in this argument is what is the case. And far from referring to the objects of epistēmē, which she takes to be forms, she takes it to refer again only to its contents, that which she identifies with propositions. She also takes for granted, without argument, that epistēmē is identical with knowledge as many philosophers today understand it, namely justified true belief. So for her, epistēmē is justified true belief, doxa, belief. Since knowledge, so understood, implies that its contents are true, what is, for her, turns out to refer simply to the set of all true propositions. So what is the object of epistēmē? It's not to on, it's not what is, or it is what is, but only if you think of what is as the set of all true propositions. And since in addition, Fine takes it that this last is a truism, but for whom, I say? Not everyone, certainly not the Greeks, believed in propositions. Propositions are a technical philosophical notion that, I guess, became popular after Frege. We can't just attribute it as a philosophical notion to other people. This is very, very unhistorical, in other words. So not everyone believes in proposition. In any case, she concludes that the argument is indeed genuinely uncontroversial. Because all that Socrates says is, look, knowledge is about truth, belief is about what is both true and not true, so the two are not the same. This is all there is to it. Some have shared Fine's worries, but found her requirement too strong. Katja Vogt, for example, has proposed a weaker version to the effect that, as she puts it, I quote, one should adapt one's questioning depending on who one's interlocutor is. That is weaker than Fine's, it's true. She agrees with Fine that Socrates appeals to the theory of forms in his first argument, the one and many argument. But unlike Fine, she also thinks that Socrates continues to refer to the forms in the argument that ensues, not to the content as Fine thinks. It's still about the forms. In fact, she thinks it's even more controversial than Fine thinks because it contains a lot of epistemology, which she says the sight lovers are not really capable of dealing with. She thinks this argument couldn't possibly, weighted as it is, couldn't possibly be addressed to the sight lovers. It's not, she writes, the kind of topic such a person is interested in, nor is he up to it. Whether the forms are involved or not, the argument is still inappropriate to them. Because these people, she says, quote, do not engage in philosophy, and their understanding is at best, quote, unsophisticated and pre-theoretical. Accordingly, the argument, sophisticated and theoretical as it is, can't be addressed to them at all. Instead, Katja Vogt argues, it continues to be addressed, quote, to a philosopher, Glaucon, who relies on, quote, his philosophical inclinations and training in answering on their behalf. In short, for Fine, the argument is addressed to the sight lovers and can't therefore be metaphysically loaded. For Vogt, the argument is metaphysically and epistemologically loaded and therefore can't be addressed to the sight lovers. you see the dilemma, the contrast that I'm trying to set up here. What they both assume, however, is that in that first effort to distinguish philosophers from sight-lovers by means of one and many, Socrates has introduced the theory of forms. That is a very widely shared view. In fact, I can't think of anybody who does not agree with it. Everybody seems to me to agree with Julianus that the full theory of forms is, quote, abruptly introduced at 476a. And I claim that this near universal assumption is wrong. It is certainly true that our passage is full of the vocabulary characteristic of the theory of forms. But the question is whether the mere presence of that vocabulary is enough to commit Plato to that theory. And the answer, I believe, is a clear no. Every term we find in this passage of the Republic is also found in Plato's aporetic dialogues, including the Euthyphro, the Protagoras, the Charmides, the Meno, and the Hippias Major. And in none of those works does the theory of forms appear. And if you look, T4 has some of those texts. Unfortunately, those are in English as well as Greek. Some of them are only in Greek later on. I apologize for that. I can hardly believe that anyone imagined that Thrasymachus, the sophist of all people, has the forms in mind when, in the first book of the Republic, he uses the expression the just and proceeds to define it as the interest of the strong. Even the vocabulary of participation, which appears in Republic 476, D, occurs freely in the dialogues in which the theory of forms never appears. That's in text 5, I have a lot of participation vocabulary. And even the vocabulary of paradigmatism, that the forms are exemplars that the sensible objects try to imitate, prominent here, did not involve the theory of forms, as you can see from the Euthyphro. And of course, neither that is vocabulary of eidos and its cognates. All those terms are used before almost everyone except some very, very strict Unitarians who think that Plato had everything already figured out before he started writing his dialogues, which is not a view that really can take very seriously believe. No one else believes that the theory of forms appears in the aporetic dialogues, and yet they are full of the vocabulary that the theory of forms. In other words, Plato takes a more or less commonsensical vocabulary and gives it a highly controversial interpretation. This is what I'm trying to argue. The theory of forms itself requires more than just that vocabulary. It requires two additional principles that are nowhere to be found in the Republic so far. The two interconnected principles are, one, the separation of the forms from the participants, and secondly, their intelligibility, the fact that they're not to be perceived. Whatever exactly separation comes to, I don't think it is compatible with Socrates' view in Book 5 that, as I already quoted him, that while each eidos is one, it appears in combination with actions, bodies, and other eidae, and therefore appears to be many. According to the full theory, the forms which are both separate and intelligible don't appear at all. It's not that forms don't appear at all. One might have questions about that, and we can talk about it. The eidae to which Socrates appeals may well be features immanent in their interests that appear themselves to various perceivers, in contrast with the forms. He talks about those characters in the Phaedo, where he distinguishes the tallness of nature from the tallness in us, and has a longish discussion of it. He also, in the Parmenides, when Parmenides says to Socrates, have you yourself distinguished similarity itself from the similarity that we possess? So the forms may have sensible instances, but it's not the form itself that appears. It's a separate ontological object. In the end, however, whether those immanent characters are involved here or not, the fact remains that Plato's vocabulary in this passage in no way introduces the metaphysical apparatus of the theory of forms, a metaphysical apparatus that goes beyond, that is, what we are already familiar with from the Socratic dialogues. We have not yet, so to speak, entered the metaphysics of the Republic in any way in this passage. Even the temporal qualifications that Plato uses here in his distinction between the one and the many do not introduce any radical new feature in his thought. To be sure, he tells that the idea of beauty is always the same in every way. Philosophers are said to see things themselves and always the same in every way. They're supposed to love that being that always is and is not rolling, as he puts it, between being and not being. The aporetic dialogues, again, are full of descriptions of the one that they're trying to define as always being that way. I won't bother you with the text right now, but I just take my word for it. The distinction, all the distinctions, in other words, on which Plato draws at this point are logical. Their ontological foundations and implications do not enter the discussion until considerably later. After all, in recapitulating his arguments at the beginning of what is called Book VI, Socrates makes it clear that his account of who the philosophers and who the non-philosophers are is quite preliminary. The difference, he tells us, has been made scarcely clear. Mogis post. It means we've hardly touched the subject. Mogis is a word that both Plato and Aristotle use when they say this, we just made a first preliminary step here. What is genuinely new so far is a considerable detail, more detail than we have ever been exposed to before, in which at the beginning of Book VI now, Plato goes on to describe the philosopher's ethical character in almost 20 pages of text before he turns to the metaphysical issues that distinguish them from the rest of the world. It is only after giving such a detailed account of the philosopher's character and the difficulties they face in bad societies that Socrates announces that the philosophers must undergo serious training in what is described as the most important learning. Glaucon, who again doesn't know what it is, asks what that is, and Socrates replies that if the philosophers are to learn these things, they must pursue them as intently as they earlier appeared engaged in physical exercise when he was describing the education of the guardians, and so that they can finally understand them. Understanding is the most important subject. The discussion then turns to the nature of this most important subject, which turns out to be nothing other than the form of the good, and Socrates undertakes to explain it by means of the famous images and similes of sun, line, and cave. And as he begins the first of these, the sun, he reminds Glaucon of two things, he says. First, things that we discussed earlier in our conversation, and then other things that we have discussed on many other occasions. Well, what I addressed earlier in the conversation is the distinction between the one and the many, between the many good things and the single idea we have just been discussing ourselves. What I discussed on other occasions, I guess, must mean the distinction between the sensible and the intelligible realm, already touched upon in the Phaedo and the Symposium, that Socrates is about now to introduce formally for the first time in the Republic. The many beautiful and good things which the non-philosophers focus on, Socrates now says, when he finally makes the distinction between sensible and intelligible, they are seen, more generally perceived, while the idea can only be thought about. None of that in Book V, none. This is the ultimate basis and the constant companion of the whole program of the philosopher's higher education, which leads them from mathematics to real astronomy to dialectic and finally to the forms, then back to the affairs of the city, and finally back up to dialectic and the form of the good. It is only at the end of this long presentation, with all its complex ontological and epistemological discussions, through which the theory of the separate and intelligible forms is introduced and detailed, that we fully know what a philosopher really is. Only after the philosopher's 50-year-long path from childhood to human perfection has been completed, and they have seen the form of the good. What began as a kind of joke ends in utter seriousness. And it is only then that Glaucon, realizing that Socrates' account is finally complete, compliments him for his accomplishment. Like a sculptor, Socrates, he says, you have put the finishing touches and brought forth the most beautiful rulers. Everything up to that point, especially the discussion in which Book V ends, has been preliminary. So I come to another section now, Philosophers versus Sightlovers, Part 2. The objects of doxa and epistēmē are distinct. This is absolutely crucial to my argument. Socrates now proceeds to try to convince the sightlovers that they have only doxa, a second-rate cognitive relation to the world, while philosophers have a privileged relation, epistēmē, whose object, what is distinct from the object of doxa. Now, if, as I've been saying, Socrates has not brought the theory of forms into the discussion so far, then there is no reason to think that what is, as he proceeds to use it in the present argument, refers to the forms at all. In addition, I don't see that the argument involves a sort of sophisticated epistemological issues that prompt Vogt to deny that Socrates can be addressing the sight-lovers and claim that Glaucon, who's supposedly familiar with the theory of forms, is answering for them. Fine is right in saying that the argument is not technical and that it is addressed to the sight-lovers. But she's wrong to think that the way to understand it non-technically is to understand what is as what is the case or as the class of true beliefs. I will now try to show why I believe the argument, how I believe the argument should be understood. Eventually, I'll try to explain what type of person the sight-lover is. So to begin with, it should be clear that the distinction between epistēmē and doxa does not require that we identify the object epistēmē, what is, with the forms. That epistēmē and its cognates are of what is was a commonplace in Greek thought. It was nothing more than a commonplace, I said, which Plato eventually interpreted controversially as referring to the entities that he considered as what is, as being, that is, as fundamental to the world. When Protagoras wrote that man is the measure of all things, of all things that are, that they are, of those things that are not, that they are not, he was certainly not thinking of the forms. In fact, he was precisely producing a subjectivist or relativist theory that made sort of a salad of the theory of forms. Aristotle, for his part, is clear, as he puts it, epistēmē takes what is something as being that something. It says that what is, using the expression without explanation. And when Socrates in the Cratylus asks Hermogenes, what makes a sentence true? Is it that it says that what is? Well, what makes a sentence false? That it says that what is not? Hermogenes, who's no philosopher, is perfectly eager and able to understand it and eager to agree. T7 in the handout. This exchange, moreover, shows that the same principle governs both epistemic and linguistic contexts, as Parmenides had already asserted in a famous phrase. You could never have gnosis, he said, of what is not, nor could you say it, nor could you express it. Someone who has gnosis, Socrates claims, and Glaucon agrees, has gnosis of something. When you know something, when you have gnosis of something, you must know something, not nothing. Of something, in fact, that is, since what is not, cannot be an object of gnosis. That's exactly what Parmenides was saying before. You cannot know that which is not. They also agree that what fully is fully an object of gnosis, while what in no way is altogether not such an object. I have a discussion here of those qualifications, fully and purely and in no way, whatever. I will skip them because I think they're not really relevant to what we're talking about, not directly relevant anyway. But if you like, take them out in discussion. What I want to argue now is that to have epistēmē of what is not just to take it correctly that what is. In other words, epistēmē, it's not sufficient to have epistēmē of something that the sentence in which we express it is true. Snow is white is actually not an object of epistēmē. Something more has to be added to the object of epistēmē to make it appropriate for it. And I'll try to explain what that is as I go on now. Epistēmē requires taking that what is, and also that it cannot in any way not be. In other words, there's a modal component in what epistēmē accomplishes. What I have epistēmē of when I have epistēmē of something is that it is as it is and in no way is not. It's so in every possible way. And don't forget that what we know about the forms, right, is that they are everything that we say they are, from every point of view, in every way, from no qualification. So here Plato is preparing what will become the theory of forms without actually giving you the ontology of what those objects are yet. He's giving you the logical features of them. Glaucon agrees with Socrates that if there is something that both is and is not, right, unlike the object of epistēmē, which is but never is not, if there's something that both is and is not, then it would lie between the two extremes of what fully is on the one hand and what is no way is not on the other. And since gnosis or epistēmē has been assigned to what is, and agnoia or ignorance, if you want, to what is not, it would be reasonable to ask whether there is a power between these two, epistēmē and agnoia, that concerns what objects lie between them, if there is such a thing, if there are such objects. We do think that there is such a power. This power is called doxa, which is different from epistēmē, and the two concern different things, each, Plato says, according to its own power. Now, I think that makes it clear that none of what these powers are concerned with can be a set of propositions, as the rhetorical interpretation would have it. Only true propositions for epistēmē, both true and false propositions for doxa, and only false ones for agnoia. Just like an existential reading, which takes Plato's is equivalent to exists, neither interpretation can account for the fact that Plato is absolutely clear that what is and is not at the same time. You see, he says that explicitly at 478b5. Everything that the sightlovers bring is both what you say it is and what it isn't at the same time. But nothing can be either true and false at the same time. Nothing can exist and not exist at the same time. What is left, therefore, is a predicative reading, which takes is and is not, to involve a suppressed reference to predicates that the object of epistēmē is the sound bothering you? Is the sound, okay. So, let me repeat that sentence. What is left is a predicative reading, which takes is and is not, to involve a suppressed reference to predicates that the objects of epistēmē have at all times and can never be without. Predicates that are co-present with their opposites in their objects if they are the objects of doxa, and predicates that are completely lacking in the case of agnoia. It is a version of this predicative approach that I will try to present and defend in what follows. Every interpreter of this passage in the Republic has discussed the relationship between these three powers and their objects. And let's make no mistake, agnoia is as much of a power as epistēmē and doxa. Not everybody agrees. Not only does Plato's parallel treatment of the three support this conclusion, so does his statement, quote, at 479a, that if anything turned out to be of that other sort, it would have to be called an object of doxa, not an object of epistēmē, a wandering in between object, grasped by the in-between power. When he says that, it means that the in-between power is flanked by two other powers, one of which is agnoia. So agnoia is a power, and some people think that it can't be because it's negative. It's a lack of power rather than a power. That's not how Plato thinks about it. It's important to remember that even adikia, injustice, the inability to act justly, is taken as a power in the discussion in Book I. Well then, Socrates asks, if injustice arises within a single individual, will it lose its power or will it retain it undiminished? Don't be confused by the fact that he says it has a power. He says exactly the same about the powers in Book V. He moves indifferently from is a power to has a power. It says they are distinct, doxa and epistēmē are distinct according to their own power. Each has its own power. He really moves back and forth between them. That the objects of gnosis and doxa are distinct is more than enough to show how inappropriate it is to identify either gnosis as knowledge, understood as justified true belief, or doxa as belief, understood as we generally do, as the attitude appropriate to truth. The object's belief becomes knowledge when it is both true and justified. Their objects of knowledge and belief, whether they're sentences, propositions, anything, are ontologically exactly the same. They have exactly the same object. The only difference is that something is known when it is both true and believed for good reason. Knowledge, in other words, is a special case of belief, and its objects are a subset of the objects of belief. Fine's interpretation makes that clear. True propositions are the objects of knowledge, both true and false propositions are the object of belief. That is in stark contrast with the notions of Plato's epistemology, according to which both the cognitive powers themselves and their objects are distinct. Now, once Socrates has distinguished the objects of epistēmē and doxa, as he says, according to the power, he gives us a more detailed specification of the former, of epistēmē, which includes not just this object, what is, but also what it does or effects, ho apergazetai. Epistēmē, he tells us, is by nature set over what is, to have gnosis of what is. That is the power, the ergon, the work of knowledge. Shouldn't say knowledge. Epistēmē has gnosis that what is. Okay? Having classified all three cognitive activities as powers, offering sight and hearing as examples, he now provides a general account of the identity conditions of powers in general. He says, two powers are the same if and only if they're set over the same objects and have the same effect. Now he now reaffirms the status of doxa as a power, and although we already know that it is distinct from epistēmē, Glaucon reinforces the point on the grounds that the latter, epistēmē, is infallible. Another version of the it is and can't not be. It's infallible, it can never get it wrong. We're also told that doxa, in particular, is the power, the function of which is to make us capable of doxazen, of having doxa. He tells us that. Now, that is very elliptical, because we know from the case of epistēmē that the work of epistēmē is to have epistēmē that what is. To say that the power of doxa is to make us have doxa doesn't really explain what those doxa, the content of the doxa are. Now, you might find that acceptable if you think of epistēmē and belief, of doxa as belief. It makes sense to say, as Verity Hart, for example, has said, quote, that the effect of the power of belief just is the activity of believing. True, but that won't do for Plato's notion of doxa, as may become obvious when we compare it with what Socrates has already said about epistēmē and what he says again now. Having attributed a different function to each power, it's 478a, he reminds us in the very same words he used before, that epistēmē is set over what is, its function being to have gnosis that what is. What then exactly is the power of doxa, that which it effects, its work, in parallel with the function of epistēmē? And here we come to the last text that I have distributed to you. The function of the three powers should be coordinate. That is, epistēmē is set over what is, and its function is to have gnosis of what is. Now, the function of doxa, I want to suggest, whose range we don't yet know. Plato has not told us what it raises over, but he tells us what the power is. It has to be parallel to the power of epistēmē, is to have doxa about what is. To have doxa about what is. And the function of agnoia, which is set over what is not, is to have agnoia about what is. About what is. In other words, I'm saying that the powers are coordinate, but of course, each one does a different thing to the object of which it is the object, of which it is the power. It also seems clear that each of these cognitive powers involves a positive mental disposition, right? I'm thinking something about what is in those cases, which I would like to refer to as a consideration, or taking that. It's very weak, and it applies to all three in the same way. In all three cases, we consider that what is, we consider that what is and is not is, we consider that what is not is. So you have a very strict, nice parallel. That is, in each case, we have something in mind regarding what is, something that, depending on the context within which it appears, is transformed into epistēmē, doxa, or agnoia. Among other things, that implies that agnoia is not, as many people used to think, and still some do, quote, sheer blank ignorance, whose object, so far as this notion had any meaning, would be sheer blank nothingness, the non-existent. That was what Cross and Woosley, and what used to be the basic introduction to the Republic years ago, say, and a lot of people still think that the object of agnoia is nothing, nothingness. Julianus, however, I think is surely right to claim, quote, that ignorance is of what is not in any way, that is, completely lacks the feature ascribed to it. That is, for example, how Plato thinks of ignorance in the Meno, in a passage where Socrates argues that if people desire bad things, thinking that they will be useful to them, they don't really desire bad things. They're ignorant that they're bad and in no way useful, and desire instead things that they think are good, but are in fact bad. So the object of ignorance is the good thing, right? Which you don't know is a good thing or a bad thing, as the case may be. We are now told, back in the Republic, that there is in fact a range of objects between what is and what is not, the objects of epistēmē and agnoia, respectively, things that, as Plato puts it, both are and are not whatever we say they are, both beautiful and ugly, both just and unjust, both large and small, both heavy and light, and so on. It's those intermediate things, he says, that are the objects of doxa. And it turns out that these are precisely what the sight lovers think about when they cite not that one thing that truly or fully is what we say it is, but rather the many beautiful, just, or pious things, and the rest of the things they refer to in answering the philosophers, what is X, or what is F, what is justice, what is beauty, what is goodness, question. And that's an argument that goes from 478e following. So doxa ranges over what both is and is not, and considers, or takes it that, what both is and is not is. It identifies, in other words, the things that both are and not with the reality. That's the mistake. In parallel, ignorance ranges over what is not and considers that what is not is. And in fact, and that I think is very interesting, the Republic, right at its beginning, offers us two perfect cases of doxa and ignorance. Socrates, as most people know, rejects Cephalus' definition of justice as in part returning what you owe, by arguing that this can sometimes be just and sometimes unjust, which is equivalent to him saying it's both just and unjust, so it won't explain anything. Cephalus, that is shown in retrospect to have doxa regarding justice. By contrast, when Polemarchus takes over the argument in order to defend Cephalus, he is led into defining justice as benefiting one's friends and harming one's enemies. And Socrates counters that harming anyone is never just. Polemarchus, to the extent that he endorses that definition, he shows to be ignorant regarding justice. It is only the philosopher who considers that justice is nothing other than doing one's own. That doing one's own, which is never unjust in any way, is just who has epistēmē. So we have the three cases. So anyway, okay, let me go on. Since the objects of epistēmē and doxa are distinct, is the philosopher's expertise limited to what is, leaving the whole realm of both what both is and what is to the sight lovers? Right? Maybe that now that philosophers know what is, but they know nothing about what's in the further down below, because that would mean that they would have doxa, and doxa is the province of the sight lovers. How could the philosophers have it? That's been a very major question, especially as I'll tell you, as I'll go on to say, because of the fact that philosophers have to rule in the city and therefore have to have some kind of knowledge about the sensible world. As I said, this is a question that has been absolutely central to this discussion of this passage for two reasons. As Descartes has put it, first, because, excuse me, I quote, "It is possible for one person to have knowledge of the very thing that another person believes," something I've denied already. No, it's true about knowledge. It's not true about epistēmē. And second, because, I quote again, "If Socrates' position entails that a knower of the form of justice cannot bring that knowledge to bear in knowing of some action that it is just, it is hard to see how the philosopher's hard-won knowledge will bring them." Have I been going for an hour?
I think it's just about 55 minutes that you've been talking.
I have another 5 or 10 minutes. Is that all right?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Sorry about that.
You just a very short question at the end.
All right, I'll try to go fast. Oh, this is, all right. Okay. So the second is, if you know the knowledge that you have of justice, you can't apply to a sensible world, as they put it, then it's hard to see how the philosopher's hard-won knowledge will bring them much success in ruling. I believe that the problem raised here depends on three fundamental assumptions. They are, I've already remarked, the assumption that what is refers to the forms, that epistēmē and doxa are equivalent to knowledge and belief, and that all the features that characterize philosophers and enable them to rule are provided in this passage of the Republic. None of them is correct. Plato has not yet argued that what is refers to the forms, which he does not fully introduce until later. And what he does later is to appeal to this distinct class of objects that, as I said before, are both separate and intelligible. It is only at that point that the theory of forms, which Plato introduces to explain the nature of the philosophers, and in part to describe the kind of learning and the type of life they must engage in, it's only then that the theory of form comes into the argument. It is because epistēmē and doxa are considered equivalent to knowledge and belief that the fact that their objects are distinct appears so surprising. It is because the objects of epistēmē are the separate and intelligible forms that the ability of philosophers to rule, which concerns the sensible domain, comes into question. And it is because we expect to find a full account of the philosopher's qualifications here that we want an interpretation of the passage that will show how that account allows them to be rulers. But none of the assumptions is correct. In contrast to knowledge, whose domain includes every true position, the domain of epistēmē is much narrower. It is not simply that doing one's own is just, but more that it is always and in all circumstances just, that it is never unjust. It is in that sense that epistēmē is infallible. Doxa in turn is not infallible. Plato does not explain what he means by these terms, but it is telling that not once in this passage, or more or less in the Republic, does he use the expression orthodoxa, true belief, as we generally translate it. He's not interested in that at all. What interests him in this passage in particular is not the question of the philosopher's ability to rule the city. That comes into view gradually and over the course of the next two books. Rather, he's only interested in the question of the unity or plurality of the answer to the question, what is X? Which takes the general form of citing what both is and is not as what is, returning what you owe, for example, as answer to the question, what is justice? That answer is never, strictly speaking, correct, since returning what you owe, which is both just and unjust, is not the correct definition of justice. But it is also not strictly false either, because sometimes it is true that, that returning what you owe, when it's a case of doing your own, is just. Falsehood, unqualified, belongs only to ignorance. So the question is, when the sightlovers answer the question, what is X, by saying, returning what you owe, are they answering in terms of types of tokens? That is, when Socrates says, what is piety? Is he told this particular action is pious, or is he told this kind of action is pious? To make a long story short, and if we have time for the questions, we can take it up. I think it's always a type. It's never, the answer to Socrates' question is always, for example, in the Euthyphro, what I am now doing, namely, prosecuting my father for murder, is pious. It's not the answer, that's what Socrates is interested in. He's not interested in whether Euthyphro's action is or is not pious in particular. He wants to know what it is that explains that piety, if it does in fact possess it. Okay, so all the discussion here is done in terms of explanations of the features of things, not about the features of things in particular. So a particular action, a particular person can't be just or unjust, beautiful or ugly, when you put them in a particular context. See, a beautiful maiden compared to other maidens can be beautiful. Compared to a goddess, she's ugly. That's from the Hippias Major. It's not that the maiden herself is both beautiful and ugly. It's being a beautiful maiden that is beautiful when the context is a goddess, and true when the context is human beings. In other words, the sightlovers will say that what makes a particular action just is that there's an instance of returning what one owes, which is what justice is. The philosopher will counter that returning what one owes is both just and unjust. And it is just when and only when returning what one owes is, as a matter of fact, a case of doing one's own. The disagreement is at the level of the explanation of the features of actions, not at the level of the features themselves, as we have in all of the apologetic dialogues. The people, therefore, we usually refer to as the sightlovers, are all characterized by the same attitude. None of them is willing or able to agree that justice, beauty, courage, piety, etc., in contrast to the various manifestations, is always one and the same thing. It's Mino, remember, the virtue of a man, the virtue of a woman, the virtue of a child, the virtue of an old person. I can't ever find one thing. It's always many. It's like the bees, remember, and all that sort of thing. The sightlovers, therefore, are not to be thought of as a specific kind of people. For example, as somebody has said, aesthetes, Or as Connie Meinwald says, people who proceed on the assumption that one learns about life and becomes civilized by assimilating the cultural lore of the works of the great poets. No, they include almost everyone Socrates discusses the nature of virtue with in Plato's aporetic dialogues. The sight lovers, remember, it's a term that applies only to some of the people involved here, are Socrates' interlocutors. That's what I would have to say. But although now the object of episteme and doxa are distinct, in having episteme, philosophers do have something else as well. In taking it and considering that what is, that doing one's own is what is to be just, they're also aware that what is and is not, both is and is not. When you know that what is, right, you also know that what both is and is not, both is and is not, which is exactly what Socrates tells the sight lovers they're doing. And that simply means that philosophers are aware that in some circumstances in which returning what one owes is in fact the case of doing one's own, returning what you owe is just. At this point, we don't know if this is or is not episteme. The passage is silent on the precise nature of the cognitive relationship philosophers have to the domain of what both is and is not. But it does imply that they're in a position to have more authoritative views than the sight lovers with whom they're being contrasted. And it should, for the philosophers don't simply take it that doing one's own is just. In contrast to the sight lovers, they're awake and do not live in a dream. They realize that returning what one owes is a likeness of, that it participates in being just, that is in doing one's own, which in turn means that in itself, if I could use that expression about a thing that both is and is not, it is both just and unjust or neither. Returning what one owes can't explain why some action is just, even when it is a case of one's own, since it can also explain why a different action is unjust, when it is a case of not doing one's own. It is the latter, doing one's own, that provides the needed explanation. That is exactly what we have learned in the Phaedo. A head is not what makes someone tall. Two is not meant to have something large, cubit, etc., etc. It's only largeness that does it. In short, philosopher and sight lover can in some cases agree that an action is just or a person beautiful. The disagreement is over what accounts for justice or beauty. Does the philosopher's cognitive attitude regarding that action or person count as episteme? I don't think the text allows us to decide. Nor does it explain how the philosopher, in virtue of taking justice or beauty of one and not many, is qualified to govern the city. These are issues that are only raised in the two books that follow. The argument of this essay, this paper, this lecture now, perhaps frustratingly, is negative and deflationary. And I hate myself for it, but I can't help it. I claim that considerably less is accomplished in this passage than we often think. It's only a very small step in Plato's ambitious argument and draws both Socrates' interlocutors and Plato's readers in by being precisely tongue-in-cheek and relatively uncontroversial. What we actually see in this passage are things that we have been seeing throughout the early dialogues. Nothing new, really, except for the three-part distinction of knowledge of episteme, doxa, and agnoia is introduced. As I have been arguing, almost everything here is already present, implicitly or explicitly, in the Socratic dialogues, and Plato uses what he believes he can count on intellectually to construct the deeply controversial view to which he believes it leads. Thank you, and sorry to have taken so long. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk. Yeah, it was really interesting and very kind of.
I hope it was not too technical and too textual, but that's all I have at the moment. That's
no, I think also, I think it was like a very interesting talk. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, we can do that very briefly. I know we're kind of running tight on time.
I'm very sorry about that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no worries. But I think there's a raise your hand feature in this. So if you want to do that, I can call on you, or you can type a question into the chat and you can answer it that way.
I think we've only got thumbs up, and so shall we say thumbs up for asking questions?
Oh yeah, sure. The thumbs up will serve as the raise your hand feature. So if you do that, I can see it on the side and then call on you.
I think I see one. Is it Isaac?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Isaac.
Hi there. Thank you for that talk. It was
Hey.
really amazing. I'm sorry this is a bit of a rudimental question, but we were just talking at the end about who exactly the lovers is, who Plato has in mind when he's talking about the lovers of sounds and sights. But when we finally get a definition of the philosopher king in Book VII, is this supposed to be, does Plato have himself in mind as someone who has the understanding of forms and is now qualified for ruling? Or is this meant to be an ideal type?
It's difficult to say. Did you say this, that Plato think of himself as such?
Or maybe does Socrates think of himself?
Socrates doesn't. He says early on when he introduces the form of the good that he doesn't really understand it completely. And it's a peculiar passage there because he goes on to talk about it at great length. But even so, he disavows complete knowledge of it. The idea is that you have to go through this 50-year process of education to be a philosopher. So the question is, what is Plato's own position? That's the very interesting question you're asking. We never know because he never appears. You know, it's in a way, somebody might be tempted to think that Plato is to philosophy what Freud is to psychoanalysis, right? The only one who didn't need to be psychoanalyzed in order to practice psychoanalysis. But we just don't know.
Okay.
But for Plato, you see, the important issue is that philosophy is a very, very broad-ranging and ambitious enterprise. And part of the reason why we attempted to find the whole definition of philosophy in the end of Book V is that we have forgotten this aspect of philosophy for the Greeks and for the ancients in general. We think of it, as we do, as the ability and the devotion to argument. And that's what you get in Book V. You get argument. But that's not enough for it to be philosophy for Plato. There's much, much more to it. And I think that to some extent, we have imported our own assumptions, A, about what philosophy is, and B, about what knowledge is in trying to understand this passage. And I think we've made not necessarily a mess of it. I don't think that we've made a mess of it, but I think we have not seen how incredibly methodical and single-minded the argument from the end of Book V to Book VII is. Don't forget that these books were divided because the papyrus or the parchment or whatever it is ended at a particular time, a particular thing. It's not if I were doing this, I would have begun Book VI, where the end of Book V begins, at 475 or so, when he introduces the philosopher kings. That's where I would have ended the book. So you can see the continuity. But because this is tacked on the end of Book V, we think of it as an argument in its own right. In fact, it isn't. So thank you very much. That's an excellent.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes, and if we have any other questions, I think we have time for about, yes, great. Eric, you can ask.
Thank you very much for your talk. I thought it was very interesting.
Well, it would be even better if I'd had a glass of wine along with you.
I was wondering whether this different understanding of epistēmē as more like a modal claim about necessity, whether you think this has an impact on how we should read Plato's other works. Yeah.
No, I think it's absolutely crucial to think that epistēmē is an incredibly narrow and extremely demanding relationship that we have to the world. Only very few things can be objects of epistēmē precisely because of that modal connection. It's a modal connection that he inherits directly from Parmenides. For me, Greek philosophy really begins with Parmenides. And I think that, and in fact, what's amazing about it is that all later Greek philosophers accept all the conditions that Parmenides puts upon being in fragment B8. It's the same all the way through. It never changes, it never comes into being, it never except for one. They all accept many of those things in the world. In other words, Parmenides supposedly argued that there's only one thing, but in fact, the text is ambiguous. It's perfectly ambiguous whether he's arguing there exists only one thing or whether he argues everything that exists is one. Everything that is real is one, which is compatible with there being many. And my view is that Melissus, his pupil, goes on and on about how there's only one thing precisely because Parmenides hadn't made it clear. And then we see the elements in Empedocles. Every one of them satisfies every Parmenidean condition, but there are many of them. The atoms of Democritus and Lysippus, the homoiomere of Anaxagoras, the forms of Middle Plato. Each one is like being in Parmenides, but there are many. And even in the Parmenides, when they confront each other, Parmenides never says, "Why do you have more than one?" He never says that, right? He says, "Oh yeah, let's take those things and show that each one of them is not one." You see. So this is absolutely crucial for me. And so it has to be one in this extraordinarily strong sense. And the only cognitive relationship that it can have to be is this epistemic relationship, which qualifies very few people. You see, very few people are featured by it. So to have episteme and to have knowledge are two completely different things. Don't forget that for Plato and for Aristotle, as Aristotle says, only the universal is the object of episteme. For the Greeks, you don't have episteme of the fact that it's raining out there, or that it's sunny out there, or that you're wearing a hoodie. Those are not objects of episteme. So it's okay. Does that help a bit?
Yeah, that was very interesting, particularly because I've been studying Parmenides recently.
Oh, you are? Oh, he's the greatest.
With a very interesting link there. Thank you very much.
If you're interested in that, I'd be glad. I have written something about it. I'd be glad to send it to you if you let me know.
That'd be really, really nice. Thank you.
Okay, if anyone has some last question, you can put the thumbs up. But yeah, if not, actually, I have one question that's a bit of a kind of a clarification question, I think, because when you were talking about this idea of putting things like in context, and the beautiful maiden maybe is not beautiful compared to a goddess or something like this, I was just wondering how it would work that it could be a relative trait if it was something that partook in the form. Like if someone partook in the form of beauty, how could it be that then that beauty would be only in existence relative to other things? I wasn't exactly sure how that would play out.
It's the relationship that obtains only relative to other things. You see, it's not the beauty itself, right? Beauty is right there. If I'm in a relationship with X, then I may be in a relationship with beauty. If I'm being compared to Y, then remember what he says in the Phaedo: if its opposite approaches, it either departs or disappears. But it's not the form that departs and disappears, is what he there calls it's the tallness in us. In other words, in a sense, you cease being tall when you're being compared to a taller person. That's exactly what Plato believes.
Yeah.
And it's a major innovation, this part, to allow for that, because for the Greeks, I think, when you said something like Socrates is tall, the "is" there is interpreted in an extremely strict, strong, and exclusionary way. Is, when they try to understand is, becomes is what it is to be, which is Aristotle's to TNNI, right? So how can you have Socrates be tall if the statement Socrates is tall, when you analyze it as a Greek philosopher language, so to speak, says Socrates is what it is to be tall? Impossible, right? So no two things can be qualified by the same word. And this is what Plato believes, completely contrary to what we believe. We believe it's perfectly reasonable to say this is a book and that is a book, right? Both are books. And we don't think that we need anything else, right? For us, if anything, it's the idea of the book that is a problem, right? The book over and above the individual books. For the Greeks, it's exactly the other way around. Plato says, if anything is beautiful other than the beautiful itself, then it's beautiful for no other reason but because it participates in the beautiful. Crazy, right? I mean, think about it, right? Why? Because the only is that they have an analysis of at this point is the Parmenidean is. That says, it's what it is to be. If X is what it is to be Y, then X can't be anything other than Y. Because if it's also Z, right, then X is what it is to be Y. X is what it is to be Z. Right? The same thing is what it is to be X and what it is to be Z. And therefore, X and Z are not distinct. So it can only be one thing. It's an amazing, we need to think about it very seriously, because it seems to me what the Greeks didn't have is predication. And what Plato and Aristotle do, Plato in the later works, after the middle theory of forms, in the later works, after Parmenides and Aristotle, they discover predication. They discover that it's possible to say of both you and me that we're human beings without identifying us. Which, if all we have is these what it is to be, and you say that we are both human, you're saying that you are what it is to be human, I'm what it is to be human, and therefore either what it is to be human is not what it is to be human, because we are not the same, or we are the same. And those are the problems that Parmenides is constantly generating. And that's why I wanted to say before to, I think to Eric's answer, I think it's Eric, I can't remember if it's Eric or Isaac, that the middle theory of forms is, in my view, the last pre-Socratic theory. Because it's only the later Plato that says, it's okay, participation and being are not exclusive of one another. In the Sophists, the forms participate in one another. They never can do that in the middle dialogues. And that's a place where, when Parmenides, in the Parmenides, criticizes Socrates, he says to him, look, in fact, on your view, the forms can't relate to one another at all. In other words, no form can be qualified by another. In fact, forms don't participate. And that is the breakdown, that brings about the breakdown of the theory in the Parmenides. That can be, I'm sorry that I'm being too obscure right now, but the point I'm trying to make, I don't know what the point is. Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe
this describes my life right now. So, you know.
Yeah, I think a lot of people could agree with that.
Can I ask one question? Is Sarah Brodie still in St. Andrews, or is she in Edinburgh now?
I believe she's still, as of last year, she was still in St. Andrews.
I mean,
she's retired now, though, isn't she?
She has retired? She has retired?
I think so.
I think she's retired from teaching, but I think she's still working in the...
Well, if anybody sees her, say hi for me, please.
Okay, we will.
Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me. I'm sorry if my voice and my mind are not where they should be these days with the situation here, but there we are. I wish you all a very good academic year and a great life.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate that you took the time to talk to us. It was really great.
Great pleasure. Thank
you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye. And Eric, if you want, I'll send you those pieces if you get in touch with me.
That'd be really, really nice. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.